Yes, welcome into SportsBIT. Betting Insight today, Pauly and Teddy. Thursday, March 30th, big game breakdown, the NIT Final. And we start with the first Final Four game on Saturday. We'll hit Gonzaga and South Carolina. A quick deep dive as well about the games being played in these football stadiums coming up. Bad beats, bad bets, bad for the books. ESPN stats and info from the get-go here. Warriors trailed by 22 and the Thunder trailed by 21. Good tweet. The first time this season, multiple teams overcame 20-point deficits to win in the same day. Huge win for the Warriors, as they look like they pretty much will do it now. They'll lock up the 1 seed in the West.
Yeah, no, and really, when you thought, if you watch both of these games, Oklahoma City was dead, all right? Golden State certainly wasn't in any position where you're looking, oh, wow, they're about to rally back and win this game. You don't see the 20-plus point deficits overcome on a daily basis in the NBA. So to see two of them on the same night, certainly unusual. But, of course, two pretty good teams in at least one of the two games. Their comeback came against an opponent that's pretty inept.
Yeah, bad beat, horrible beat. If you had Orlando plus the 5, they lost 114 to 106 in overtime at home. They led by 21, as we mentioned. They also had a 14-point lead with 6 minutes left. The missed free throws, the Westbrook 3 to force overtime. Magic still led by 3 in overtime, but a 12-1 closeout for OKC. They get the money. Unbelievable.
Oh, yeah, the Magic didn't score a point over the last 3.5 minutes of overtime. That's brutal. And it's a bizarre game. Again, we had one of these yesterday. That's a bad beat, a bad bet, and a bad situation for the books in the exact same game. But we got to point out Russell Westbrook. I mean, he's not going to win MVP. I think Harden's going to win the MVP. What Westbrook is doing and did last night, again, 57 points, 13 rebounds, 11 assists. The guy knows how to fill up a stat sheet, Pauly.
A lot of guys might take the easy way out and split the vote. I could see that happening coming up. A bad bet? Well, the over, which was steamed up from 218 to 221. It was 204 in regulation, and it turned out to be bad for the books because it fell 220.
Well, exactly. This is one of those games where you had a bad beat on the side. You had a bad bet if you're betting the over, and that over got steamed, 218 to 221, wrong side, closed 204, finished 204 in regulation. That's a bad bet. And then when it's all said and done, the over bets from 218 to 221. It falls 220. So bad for the books when it lands right in the middle. I mean, a bad game if you had the Magic plus the points, obviously, unless you're a bookmaker. The early overs team cashed or pushed. Those that bet back the under late also cashed, and that's never a good result for the house.
Yeah, another one bad for the house. Atlanta was only 1.5 on the road against Philly. They said, wait a second, come on. Let's bet that up to 2.5, even though the Hawks have struggled. They won by 7. Dwight Howard at 22 and 20.
Yeah, and really, I mean, when you looked at the series history here, Atlanta's owned Philadelphia. And that's one thing that I'm interested in. It's not going to be when you're building a case to bet on or against a team on a given night. Series history is not going to be the only factor that you look at. And seeing a one-sided series history is not going to be enough to get me to the window, but it certainly helps you build a case, and Atlanta's owned the 76ers, and the markets just couldn't resist a must-win team like the Hawks fighting for positioning against a non-contender, and the odds makers probably made it a little bit too easy off the opener. Yeah, you're right about Dwight Howard, though. Big night last night. Looks like he wants another go at the postseason, a guy who hasn't had a whole lot of postseason success over the past decade.
It continues. Warriors Spurs, another under for the Warriors. Very important. You get the best number. 209.5, bet down to 207.5, and then whoops, lands 208. And boy, the guards really struggle. Look at the guard play. Tony Parker, 24 minutes, no points, -6 plus minus. Patty Mills, 23 minutes, 6 points. Huge win there for the Warriors, down 22. And David West had a big game for Golden State.
I mean, he was one of those pickups. You're like, I'll bet you West is going to win them a playoff game or two when all's said and done. That guy's tough and has been in the NBA for a long, long time. But let's talk about this total, because at the end, it closed 207.5. You're going to see in your game logs, or when you go and look at some of the point spread logs, you're going to see this game as being an over. And the under streak is over for Golden State, because look, it closed 207.5 and it fell 208. Therefore, that run of 11 unders has ended. It didn't end. It hasn't ended. And if you were a good bettor, you were able to cash an under ticket on Golden State again last night. But, you bring up an excellent point, Pauly. when you talk about the issues in the backcourt for San Antonio. Look, the Spurs can win the front court battles in playoffs against anyone, but I really don't know that they can, Pop can realistically say, I'm going to throw Tony Parker and Patty Mills out there against the likes of Curry or Westbrook or Harden or Paul or Conley and expect to win those battles. I think it's a problem for San Antonio, and that's why I do not look, as good as the Spurs are, I do not think this team is a championship contender this year. The backcourt is simply too weak.
Incredible run. 12 in a row and 17 and 1 the last 18 to the under with Golden State if you got the appropriate number. NIT Championship and Gonzaga and South Carolina up next on SportsBIT. Betting insight today on SBRpicks.com.
Go to SBRodds.com. Browse, compare, and shop live odds available at top online sportsbooks.
Back on SportsBIT, betting insight today, Pauly and Teddy. Big game breakdown. Live odds, sportsbookreview.com, and powered by UWager. Georgia Tech, TCU, NIT Final. TCU laying 3.5, 133 the total. We'll be talking about defense a lot today. You don't have to wait for the Final Four to get to it. We told you Tuesday how good this Georgia Tech defense was. Held Bakersfield to 21 of 60 from the field, forced 15 turnovers. They blocked 8 shots, and 30% of all Bakersfield possessions ended with a turnover or a block shot. Tech, 6th in the nation in adjusted defensive efficiency. Pastner does a great job of building chemistry in his first season with a limited roster. Good job here, Teddy.
Yeah, no question. And I mean, when we look at the Georgia Tech defensive numbers, again, number 6 in the country in adjusted defensive efficiency, number 17 in effective field goal percentage allowed, number 2 in block shots. That's a great stat from the MIT semis, where 30.8% of all Roadrunner possessions ended with a turnover or a block shot. That's not even having a chance to get to the rim. That's what Georgia Tech does. And all the teams, as we talked about earlier in the week, the teams that finished around Georgia Tech in that adjusted defensive efficiency standings, they were all, elite seeds in the NCAA tournament, or, teams like South Carolina that made remarkable runs to the Final Four. Georgia Tech, the only team in the top 7 who didn't get a big dance bid. And obviously, the way they played here in the NIT, you can make a case that they deserved it. You talked about Pastner, his quote, "It's been a heck of a season. And as I said, it's a great lesson for me that these guys, to see it all unfold, the power of team. That gets thrown in words a lot, team and chemistry, but to really see it and how we've been able to beat teams that are more talented than we are, because that night we were the better team. And when we're in areas where we're playing teams that have better talent than we do, some of our wins have come that night because we were the better team. There's no question. The chemistry for this Georgia Tech squad has been extraordinary, but TCU's got pretty good chemistry too.
They ran great offense in the win against Central Florida. 20 assists on 26 made baskets against the 16th ranked D. Remember that table and those stats we showed you on Tuesday's show? Now they can match the school record for wins. Would be the 24th tonight, and that record was set Jamie Dixon's senior season in 1987. Good year. Twins won the World Series, and his continued run of success at MSG goes back to the Pitt days. Dixon, quote, "I love this place. I'm a New Yorker by my parents. Try to get the message across to our players how important it is to play at MSG. I think the players sensed how important it is to me, and I appreciate them for recognizing that and understanding my connection with New York and our family's connection to West Point and the Garden. We love this place." So, it's a good game today, Tenny, but what do you think the key is to who's going to win this one?
Well, I mean, Georgia Tech, they run a lot of changing zones that opponents have struggled with. And I think even a TCU offense that had 20 assists on 26 made baskets in the opener here may struggle against some of the looks they're going to see against Georgia Tech. But especially because you have, 1 day of film work, 48 hours between the two. But that TCU offense and their ability to move the basketball effectively against all kinds of good defenses that they've seen this season, I think that serves them well here. And obviously, there aren't a whole lot of coaches who've had more success on the Madison Square Garden floor than Jamie Dixon. Remember how his teams at Pitt used to do in the Big East tournament year after year after year, winning at MSG. And you read that quote, Dixon, "I love this place." I'll bet he does. It's been a good run for TCU, or for Jamie Dixon's teams, I should say, at Madison Square Garden.
Up next, Game 1, Final Four, 3 o'clock Pacific Saturday. Let's start early. Gonzaga In South Carolina, live odds, sportsbookreview.com. Zags 6.5, 138.5 the total. The defensive matchup, a classic. Throw up this graphic. How about these numbers? Overall defense, number 1 against number 2. Effective field goal percentage, number 1 against number 12. 3-point percentage and 2-point percentage. You see the breakdown there. But they do it with a different style. Turnover percentage, the Zags 222. South Carolina 4th. The Zags don't press, and they rely on setting up their size in half court. But once in half court, they get physical. You got Matthews 6'4", Goss 6'3", Perkins and Nelson 6'4". And you see the front court rotation. Karnowski 7'1", Williams 6'9", Collins 7 feet tall. And you have Tilly, who's 6'10" as well, Teddy. This is a great defense. Number 1, obviously, the stats don't lie with this defense.
Well, it's so funny because when you read the mainstream articles and when you're watching the mainstream talking heads on TV, it's all about South Carolina's defense. And, oh, look at what South Carolina's defense. Gonzaga has better stats defensively in this tournament than South Carolina does. They have better stats for the season defensively than South Carolina does. What they don't do is create the turnovers. They don't force get the easy fast break buckets. They just play really tough half-court defense. They do it every single night. And a lot of it has to do with that size that teams struggle with, as you mentioned. When you got 4 guys standing 6'9" or taller who get playing time, and all of your guards stand 6'3" or taller, you got the size in the wings, you have the size in the post, and teams have struggled against that. Even good offensive teams have struggled against that size all season long. You talk about Karnowski, a guy who now has 135 career wins. That's number 1 all time in the history of the NCAA, breaking Shane Battier's record at 131. And this is a guy who came back after fusion surgery for a back injury. Mark Few, literally, we were rooting for him to come back from that and just be able to function and have a normal life. There was not basketball involved. So to see a guy come back from that type of an injury, carry his team to the Final Four, let's give him credit. It's a nice story. And the Zags finally getting over the hump. That's a nice story too, but not going to be easy to get past this Gamecocks team.
Well, the problem for South Carolina, they're great at scoring off of turnovers, but the half-court offense, not good. And they need to be able to drive the ball to the basket, and they've struggled when they've had to go against size. If you throw this graphic up, look at the big difference on offense. Overall, 13 to 104, effective field goal percentage, 6 to 299, 3-point percentage, 2-point percentage. You see that in the schedule. It's adjusted for schedule, but the Zags not quite as good when you look at that breakdown too. But also, Teddy, this will be key. How are the refs going to call this?
And in my mind, that's one of the key handicaps of the ballgame. When you talk about free throw attempts to field goal attempts, these come some of your better indicators to give you an idea of how a team is going to be called. So Gonzaga defensively, and it's an awkward chart in some sense, but they're number 16 in the country. So they don't give up a ton of free throw attempts. South Carolina, and we've seen it throughout the course of this tournament, number 334 in the country. They give up a ton of free throw attempts. So if the refs aren't swallowing their whistles and are blowing the whistles, that certainly bodes well for the Gonzaga defense. I'm going to go back very briefly to the last chart that we put up. You talked about the overall defense versus the effective. Only the overall numbers are adjusted for schedule. So the Zags may not be quite as good, the 99 overall schedule, and South Carolina not quite as bad because they face the number 28 schedule as they show. But let's not forget, in addition, the South Carolina stats are going to include layups and dunks off of turnovers that make their offense perhaps look a little bit better than it actually is. But, if South Carolina is not getting turnovers, and they're not getting a ton of free throws, the load's going to fall here on Sindarius Thornwell. He's had a heck of a tournament, Pauly. But, 103 points, 30 rebounds, 10 assists, 8 steals, 4 blocks. Yeah, he's had a heck of a tournament. He could be a guy who was the MVP of the SEC during the regular season, but that's a lot for Thornwell to do it again here in a Final Four setting after carrying the team the first 4 games.
I don't think the layoff hurts anybody because the Zags finally get over the hump, and South Carolina wasn't expected to be here or do anything in the tournament either. So I don't know if that favors anybody because it's 2 teams that they're not used to this. And again, South Carolina was 300 to 1 in some spots on March 9th. We'll get to this game coming up at the play of the day. Up next, the dome effect. Is it a myth? Is it real? We'll look at some of this coming up since they moved to these football stadiums in 1997 on SportsBIT. Betting Insight today.
Research before you bet. Be sure to check out SBR Picks for the best game predictions, breakdowns, and much, much more.
Back on SportsBIT, wrapping up. Time for the deep dive. Don't forget the Google Hangout, by the way, tonight at 8 o'clock Pacific. All right. The dome effect. Starting with 2 regionals in 2008 and the Final Four in 2009, they moved the court to midfield. The new setup enabled 70,000 plus fans to attend the biggest games, but also created rampant speculation that distance and these backdrops behind each hoop were impacting shooting, particularly three-point shooting. It was dubbed the dome effect. So we reviewed all these Sweet 16, Elite 8, Final Four, and National Championship games since 2006. You're talking 330 team performances in 165 games, and contrary to popular belief, can you believe this? Teams shoot threes better in domes with the court at midfield than anywhere else, Teddy.
Yeah, and you know, it's one of these situations where this is an academic study that we're looking at. So we're not talking about second-tier data. We are talking about a situation where the conventional wisdom was completely wrong. You know, think back 1996. You know, Continental Airlines Arena in New Jersey was the last time there was a Final Four held at a basketball arena. And the attendance for the national championship game that year, 19,229. Then they had a 12-year period where they played Final Fours in the corner or in the end zone of these arenas. And they got crowds of 50,000 plus. But starting with 2 regionals 2008 and the Final Four in 2009, now we've seen that court at midfield with 70,000 plus seats available. NCAA is able to make more money of it. And what we've seen is that the shooting in these domes has been better, not worse than you might expect. And again, the data going back to 2006, 330 teams over 165 games. So it's a decent sample size. We're not talking about a tiny sample size here. We're talking about close to a decade's worth of data. And you're right, Paulie, it goes against the conventional wisdom. Teams have been shooting threes better in domes with the court at midfield, and the shooting has not deflated these Final Four totals.
And they think they can get 75,000 in there in Glendale. And look what happened last year in Houston. It didn't affect Jenkins. And that was a high-scoring game with Nova and North Carolina. And then both teams shot, especially Villanova, shooting the three well.
Well, yeah. I mean, when you think about the NRG Stadium last year, I mean, to configure a football place for hoops, it's not easy. It's crazy. Look at the work that they do to put that in. But obviously, it's worth it for them to do it because they can sell a whole lot of seats. And, I mean, it doesn't matter how bad the setup is for fans. You know, some of these seats way up in the nosebleeds, you can barely see the court. I'd rather watch it on TV than be in a nosebleed situation for some of these contests. But 75,000 fans, and I think in midcourt, it certainly didn't bother Chris Jenkins on that final shot last year, Paulie. And when we look at the three-point shooting, again, you have better than average three-point shooting teams when we get to the Final Four. But even adjusting for the team's averages over the season shooting three-pointers, you know, didn't bother Jenkins last year. I'm not convinced it's going to bother anyone in Glendale this weekend.
All right, I'll leave it up to you. Which game do you want under?
Which game do you want under? That's an excellent question. I want to go with the game tonight when it comes to the play of the day under the total. And we're going to go with Georgia Tech TCU under 133 as our play of the day. And we were debating back and forth. We use the under in the Final Four game, and we the under in the NIT game. And I'm worried a little bit more about pace when it comes to the Big Dance game. I think there's a chance that both Gonzaga and South Carolina look to push the tempo a little bit. I don't expect any of that tonight with TCU playing Georgia Tech. 2 really good defensive teams in a game that I expect to be relatively low scoring. So let's do it. Game number 7-11, 7-12. Georgia Tech, TCU under 133. That's our play of the day.
And hey, also keep an eye on this tonight. A viewer pointed this out on Twitter. The Bulls are at home against the Cavs. They've won 18 games in a row on Thursday night TNT home games. See if the streak continues. They haven't lost since, I think, 2013 against the Heat. Google Hangout 8 o'clock Pacific, and then also we'll do Oregon and North Carolina coming up on a loaded show Friday with a little baseball mixed in as well on SportsBIT. Betting Insight today on SBRPicks.com.